methods of training of singers and various breathing methods that had been developed in different exercise systems that were becoming popular at the time, and he obviously studied those. So he certainly wasn't original with a lot of that stuff, but I think that what he put together in terms of a method of teaching, even though from what I've read and talked with people who had some kind of closer exposure to him as a person, that he may have been a exceptional teacher in terms of working with individual students, but as a teacher of teachers, he probably wasn't that good.
Yeah.
It seems like he didn't really, his work was it's sort of like Krzyzewski's in a way, and in a way the kind of problems that I've had integrating this mind and body stuff, because people tend to separate them. Mm-hmm. He was dealing with an area that doesn't really fit very well into people's ordinary conceptual schemes. And so I think that I sense that he had problems putting what he was trying to do into words.
F.M. Alexander.
Yeah. And that may have spilled over into his attempts to train other people to do what he was doing. Somehow he managed to train enough people who got it, who were then able to carry it on. And there's different schools of thought and various, I don't know what you would call it, schools of teaching within the Alexander technique.
Yeah. And
some of them really seem to, there can be some quite heated arguments as to who has the real stuff. And for me, you got to study the tradition. I am a student in terms of Judaism. I'm a great admirer of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who he taught for years at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was the conservative Jewish seminary in the United States. And then at the end of his life, he decided to okay the setting up of a Reconstructionist college. That's what he called his particular take on Judaism. And one of his mottos was, the past has a vote,
but not a veto.
Not a veto.
Yeah.
And that's my attitude pretty much towards any kind of tradition. If you don't know the tradition, if you haven't studied it, and expose yourself to various teachers from different schools that have developed as part of that tradition, then you're probably not going to be a very adequate teacher. But on the other hand, following some form because it's the form doesn't seem adequate either to me. And ultimately you've got to find your own way and your own style based on what you studied. So that's my philosophy towards the Alexander technique as well. The past has a vote, not a veto.
One thing that struck me about Staring was how much he loathed F.M. Alexander.
Yeah, he has he seems to have I've had a little bit of personal interaction by means of email, and he's done extremely important work.
Yes.
That has not been adequate. I don't get the sense that it's been adequately recognized by the Alexander technique community as a whole. The people who I tend to hang out with, like Ron Dennis, who's a very esteemed veteran teacher, who's now in Atlanta. I think he was one of the main teachers at ACAT in New York for a long time years ago. And Ed Bouchard, who's in Chicago, and both are very favorable towards Staring, as I am, and think he's done very important work. And I would like to see Staring's work much more recognized. And you don't have to accept everything that he says or all his interpretations.
Yeah.
But he has dug up a lot of data that could be very useful for people to, if there's any tendency that any people have in the Alexander Technique community to over-idolize FM Alexander, and there's good reason to have a great deal of respect for him,
Yeah.
what he did, because he was a pioneer. But there might be, and some people might have a tendency to over-idolize him.
Yeah.
And I think Staring's work would serve as a useful antidote to that. Of course, the treatment might be a little painful,
Yes.
but nonetheless, sometimes a little pain is necessary in order to have an effective treatment.
Yeah, I've noticed like a lot of similarity between the way the Alexander world talks about FM Alexander and the way any New Age cult talks about its founder. It's like it's all FM Alexander discovered this,
Yeah.
FM Alexander taught us this,
Yeah.
and that was FM Alexander said. And it's pretty much the same, you know, if you talk to a Scientologist, you know, the way they
Right.
start talking about, you know, LRH, L. Ron Hubbard this, L.
Yeah.
Ron Hubbard
Yeah.
discovered that, L. Ron Hubbard teaches us this.
Yeah, well, I think to the extent that that kind of thing operates in the Alexander Technique world, and I don't know the extent to which it does, you notice I'm being a little political, perhaps, in distancing myself from your last remarks.
Yeah,
I don't want to agree or disagree. I just don't know what
Yeah.
the level is at this point. It's
Yeah.
2011, and I haven't had a great deal of contact with the Alexander Technique community for
Yeah.
a few years now. So I think that that tendency has been there, and Staring's work really, if they're not carrying, he wrote 2 volumes and then a shorter but very dense book based on his, I think it was, I'm not sure whether it's master's thesis. It should be a PhD thesis. The level of research that
yeah,
he
he did a PhD thesis on
PhD,
FM.
yes.
Yeah, Man's
and that was
Supreme
printed.
Inheritance.
That was printed as a book.
Yeah,
So it's basically a 1-volume, very dense, very heavy book, which I have on covering that whole the material from those 2 thick previous biographies. And that book, I think, should be. I'd like to see it much more widely.
what's the difference between
Broadcast.
the 2-volume first 43 years in the life of FM Alexander and the dense thesis?
I think he just condensed a lot of stuff from those 2 volumes
Into the thesis.
into the thesis. I haven't done a close comparative
Right.
reading of the 2. I only read, and I can't say I studied. I read the second volume that he put out originally, and then I would say I scanned the later book.
Yeah.
So I'm not in a position to really give you a comparison between the 2. But
Yeah.
my impression is that he condensed a lot of the material in those 2 big volumes. That second volume that you have now is pretty good in terms of dealing with various sources that may have influenced Alexander. So that's a useful book. But just in general, his work, I think, would be very helpful for the Alexander Technique community to be more open and find a way to get his books more widely available to the Alexander community.
Yeah. So, your book is called Back Pain Solutions. What are the most common solutions to back pain?
Well, the most common problems, there are a lot of sources, potential sources for back pain. Mm-hmm. And some of them are not things that I would like to be dealing with as a physical therapist. You
Yeah.
want to You do an evaluation.